And so, yeah, it's upon us now.
Kendall Kaut, SicEm365.com. He's also a brilliant writer for not just football, basketball. Men's basketball his forte, but he's been doing a lot when it comes to football as well. Kendall, how can Baylor compete for national titles against exploding SEC and Big Ten revenue? And you could almost, I said this, Kendall, you could probably put a few other names of programs, but you're focused, of course, on the article with Baylor. And that is a question. How can you continue to lose over the next few years if you do 30, 40 million a year and keep up?
Yep, Smokey, always a pleasure to be on. I think the framework is every curse is a blessing, every blessing is a curse for everybody. So Texas and A&M are going to have to contend with a lot of money, and you certainly would prefer that problem. You think of it as a good problem, but with every problem that Texas and A&M are going to have, they're going to realize these are kind of new problems they have to deal with. So your A&M suddenly you have to deal with, if everybody on your team's making $500,000 a year and some are making several $1 million a year, is discipline different for them? I just finished reading a new book about Nick Saban's leadership strategies, and one kind of issue they identified for Nick Saban when he was with the Dolphins is that he couldn't discipline his guys quite the same way in the NFL he could in college. So you'd still want those problems, but they're going to create different problems for the Texases, the A&Ms of the world, the Michigans of the world, and then you kind of compare them to Baylor. Look, again, I reiterate, you would want to have Texas problems, you'd want to have Michigan's problems, but you look at what Baylor has, they're going to still be able to offer something. The Royals have won a World Series in baseball. Lots of teams have competed in baseball not having the most revenue. You can complain about it, you can find a way to be better and overcome your circumstances.
Kendall, I have to ask you this before I forget, but based on your Twitter interactions about 3 weeks ago, have you heard of Jeff Levy?
You know, Paul Catalina, I have heard about him. I'd forgotten. I looked at the Wikipedia page, and then I remembered all of a sudden, wait a minute, was he the Baylor running back coach before, and he's even an offensive coordinator at a few spots? But I really appreciate, hundreds of OU fans reminding me that Jeff Levy is indeed the offensive coordinator at Oklahoma. As someone who covered Baylor, I was just totally unaware of that.
Well, there's finally some games coming up, so it is going to be interesting to see how that interaction continues this year. But Kendall, we got your back, and you know that, and agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. I'm skeptical myself in some ways as well as somebody who's an Oklahoma guy. So, yeah, right on. But when you talk about the inequity, is that why it was kind of brilliant for Joey McGuire? Do you see it that way, to have this sort of flat line basis for everybody in his program, to have NIL basically including some of the walk-ons, to keep that everybody on the same page, so to speak?
Yeah, Craig, I think it was smart for Joey to try and say, we got to hit at least a threshold that guys will at least consider us. And then if you're Joey, if you're the rest of his staff, James Blanchard and the other guys, I think he's looking to bring in for his staff that will be pretty good beyond just the crew he's assembled right now. You got to be a little different. I think what Joey's doing differently is he's trying to take the Matt Rule idea of, we're going to get the best athletes possible. Joey and the staff he's assembled will coach them up. And so if they can offer a guy at 16 who's really good, kind of like Baylor did with Austin Novosad, you offer them early, you identify them early, you get some of those guys who might only be low 3 stars originally, and they become high 4 stars, or the guys who signed at stage 2 stars, kind of like Baylor did with Xavion Howard. You trust the evaluations, and that's something they have to do a little bit differently. Whereas if you're Alabama, you're Auburn, you might say, we're not going to offer any of these guys till they're 17, and even if we do, we're going to pull back some of our offers. So it will be different. It will be challenging for them. But in the same way that Cincinnati, Houston, and a host of Group of 5 schools powered through, I mean, TCU got to the Big 12 by being better than Baylor was for all of its tenure in the Mountain West Conference. They're going to be teams that succeed outside those Power 2 leagues, and there are going to be a lot of people miserable and rich in the Big 10 and SEC.
One of the notes, and I saw this in your article, again, SicEm365.com, Kendall Kaut, the article about Baylor, how can they compete for national titles against exploding SEC and Big Ten revenue, is one of the things that I do think sometimes people they don't gloss over, is Aranda, as what seems to be as good a person as you could possibly be, humble and all of that, is a cutthroat killer. Because he fired Larry Fedora right after the season was over. And it was obvious the offense struggled, but some would have said, as you said in the article, well, it was COVID. He also then made the decision on a quarterback that's beloved in Gary Bohannon to go with Blake Shapen. He has not been afraid, has he not, to make decisions that are in the best interest of the program, not just, okay, well, let's see how it works out.
He hasn't spoken. It kind of leads to, you never want to think about a man losing his job, but I almost kind of wonder what it would be like to get fired by Dave Aranda. Does he sit you down and explain, we looked at everything and, I explored everything in competitive maturity. And you're like, Dave, you can just tell me what's going on. does he meander for a little bit? I don't know. But, yeah, he absolutely is cutthroat. I mean, Gary Bohannon, I don't think very many teams would have moved on from him. And when you see some of the doubts crept in about Baylor, a lot of people say, well, they've lost their quarterback. And the thing I kind of retort with is, well, they lost their quarterback because they think the next guy up is better. And that's not why they lost their quarterback, right? You can say Texas lost its quarterback in Casey Thompson, but for the Longhorns, they can say because they think Hudson Card or Quinn Ewers will be a better quarterback. So he certainly has shown he is not afraid to make the tough decisions, but he doesn't strike you as the guy who's going to fire you or have that personality. But he's done that multiple times over the last couple seasons.
Well, that's how, when Matt Rule was here, he wanted to run the team like the NFL does. But that's what pro teams do, right? If the next guy's better and it's time to move on, you make that decision.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, Paul. And there are sometimes people that get upset about that and say, oh, you got to be loyal to this guy or loyal to that guy. But the reality is if loyalty was the number one currency in college football, you can plug somebody from the stands and put them on the field because probably the greatest Baylor fan is in the stands, not on the field. The reality is there's a threshold for talent that must be achieved. I mean, Nick Saban preaches this all the time. It's recruiting for them. And you can still win titles if you're outside the top 10 eventually. Just because the blue chip ratio's been true for most of the time doesn't mean it's going to be true for all of time. But everyone wants to land elite recruiting, and you got to find a way to get the best players because even the dominant coaches like Saban, what Aranda did in year one at Baylor, until you have your guys, you just can't win.
So what gives Kendall? Okay, you're going to have some programs that, let's say, are making $100 million a year, and we don't know what a Baylor or Texas Tech, for example, are going to make. We know they'll pony up as best they can through their alums, but like just pure money that's being paid. So, okay, Vanderbilt's making $60 million more per year than the Red Raiders or the Bears or the Horned Frogs or whoever. What can they do with that $60 million outside of just buying like a 3-deep? Everybody's pretty much got like the colored waterfall at this point in the brand new, facility next to the brand new reworked state. I mean, all that stuff's kind of been done or is constantly being done. So what does that extra money actually do to put a team that doesn't have great culture or facilities have been holding them back over teams who are making less but have all of those same things as well?
Yeah, Craig, this is why I'm just about as absolutely certain as you can be that the players are going to get paid directly by the schools. Once the revenue has gotten this insane, it's impossible to claim these aren't employees anymore. I mean, if USC is going to have their volleyball athletes flying a plane to Rutgers, it's pretty tough to claim that your football players are not athletes when you're signing $100 million plus deals to put them on TV potentially at 9 a.m. Pacific time to play football. You just can't really make that argument anymore. And I think you saw from the Supreme Court decision, there's a little bit of reticence even to some of the arguments the NCAA's advanced recently. It only take one or two circuit courts to flip on them legally. For suddenly players are getting paid in one jurisdiction. Then you'll see if you're, Georgia and you're worried about, okay, well, even though we didn't like paying players, if they're getting paid in Ohio, we got to pay them here. So I think once that happens, that's really when the gap happens. But as you mentioned right now, I mean, if every player has an Xbox, a PlayStation, a refrigerator, a car, and their locker, at some point it's kind of like, what can you put in a locker? How many ping pong tables does anybody need? And that's when I think paying the players happens because those two leagues will say, we're not making that big of a difference versus the Big 12 if we just have a fifth practice facility. But if we give everybody $200,000 a year, that's where they think they can make up the difference. I think that's where you have to spend the money wisely because I think it is inevitable. I'd be absolutely shocked if by 2030 the payers are not getting paid directly by the schools.
But also playing into your article, I mean, what can they also do that's you can't buy culture, right? Baylor's got culture, so they might be making $60 million less than Vanderbilt, but they've got the facilities, they've got the culture, they've got the backing, they've got the recruiting hotbed. So why can't they compete with somebody who's making $60 million? What can Vanderbilt or Kentucky or whoever do with $60 million outside of just buying a team that's going to eliminate Baylor from being able to compete, playing into your idea about them moving forward?
I think all that's absolutely correct, Craig. And the thing I'd kind of add on top of that is the challenge for college football is that the market hasn't been established for what players are worth. And so suddenly you're going to have, let's say, even between donations, ads, everything. Let's just imagine you have $150 million to spend on players, which might be an excess number at Texas or A&M. Well, the thing about the NFL is we know how much Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert are all worth in the quarterback market because we've had years and years of escalating quarterback revenue compared to what do we pay running backs, what do we pay wide receivers, what's the best left tackle make, and that sort of sets the standard for everybody in the league. The challenge that's going to happen in college football is there's not that baseline for what's the top quarterback worth, what's the top running back worth, what do you pay your best outside linebacker. So we might get to a world where Michigan screws up and offers the top right tackle $10 million, and they get to the end of the season and they realize, oh my God, we don't have any money left because we blew it on a bunch of stupid guys. as compared to another team that might spend their money wisely. So this does present an opportunity if you are the teams that have $60 million compared to $140 million to say, okay, they blew all their money on these spots. Let's sign one or two good players here and then just kind of try and find 3-star talent. So there is a way it can allow them to sign one or two elite players compared to right now where it feels like Bama, A&M, Texas, Ohio State are landing all the top players. So it is a chance to compete, but with no real market establishment, it's kind of weird. I mean, if you drop $200 million tomorrow on an island and you said, let's divide it up, it'd be kind of tough to figure out what's the market for everybody. So it's like if you flip the switch and went to capitalism tomorrow, you'd kind of wonder, well, what's the price of anything? And I think that's going to be tough for these college teams to figure out.
Scott Drew and Baylor basketball have talked about the culture of joy. Obviously, we've heard about it with Baylor and Dave Aranda in football, and even really with Matt Rule as well. Can you win with just a great culture no matter what's around? Talent, you have to do that. But can you win? Can culture carry you?
Culture can get you pretty far with it, Smokey. I think that certainly there is sort of a baseline level of talent you have to have. And the key thing for the Baylors, the world, the TCUs, the Oklahoma States that feel like they're going to be competitive in the new Big 12 is be good consistently. And then you hope that if you're Baylor and you win 10 games pretty consistently, you get good one season. And then you get a little lucky that the left tackle you thought was pretty good turns out to be a star. The wide receiver you thought was pretty good is a star. Maybe you land a legacy commitment. And then the year kind of hits right for you and suddenly you compete for a title. I mean, TCU a few years back when they were playing in the Mountain West, Boise State when they were playing in the Mountain West, they felt like they were good enough to win national championships. Utah when they pounded Alabama in the 2009 Sugar Bowl. Those were teams that felt like they were good enough to win national titles. And I think when we take a step back, this era is just kind of weird because Nick Saban is so dominant that he's kind of adjusted the sport in a weird way. And if you don't have a coach like Nick Saban, he's going to retire eventually. I know he's 71. It feels like he'll coach till he's 95. But I think when he steps back, we might look back at this era and say this was more of the Saban era than how the era existed like this. So I think that's when culture will matter a lot more. When you look at it for Baylor basketball, they were pretty consistently an Elite 8, Sweet 16 caliber team over some of these years, some years not making the tournament. But then they got a little bit lucky with Jared Butler coming back, Davion Mitchell not quite having the sophomore season he wanted to have. But they had the culture in place, got a little bit lucky, and won a title. Every champion has to get a little bit lucky, but it's the culture that puts you in a place to get a little bit lucky in the first place.
And you can, if you want, address your Oklahoma fan base.
Smokey, I would just say I have nothing personally against Oklahoma. If Oklahoma goes 7-5 or 8-4 this season, I just want them to be prepared for that possibility. I think Brent Venables is a very good coach. I think Jeff Levy won 6 games after 6 games back in 2016. I'll offer no additional comments about what happened after Baylor won 6 games in 2016. But, I wish Oklahoma all the best in the SEC. I have nothing else to add for Oklahoma because I don't know that they'll be adding many playoff appearances in the future.
Paul, Craig, you should double down.
Hey, it's his opinion. It's his thoughts.
So funny. Do you not know who Jeff Levy is? As if we didn't know him. And
and not everybody's